What a drop. All you have to do to kill yourself is done. Like without armor or any protection. They just kills you instantly right there. Kinda shallow. And only like 9 blocks deep, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Kinda, yeah. There's my survival island. That's the seat I have my temple on, and it looks like nothing. Weird, I forgot that thing right there was even there. Wait, what the hell? Was that on stream? What was that? My screen just blacked out. What the hell? I didn't know what's going on.
I'm a pizza that melts in just.
They locked him inside. Cave exploring gone wrong. Numbers 14.
What is it about caves that gives you that pit in your stomach?
Quite
Is it the
literally.
darkness, the tight squeezes, or just how easy it seems to get lost forever? In today's video, we're going to go over 3 stories that I think truly highlight all of the reasons why we find caves to be terrifying. As always, viewer discretion is advised.
Mm.
10 miles south of Bloomington, Indiana is the state's
No, not
cave, the Sullivan Cave.
No, Bloomington, Indiana, not to be confused with Bloomington, Illinois, where I live really close to. Not that Bloomington. I like making that joke. Because if you don't know, in Illinois, there's Bloomington. And in Indiana, there's also Bloomington. So, yeah, we have 2 Bloomingtons in both Indiana and Illinois.
With a total mapped length of almost 10 miles, the cave is owned and managed by the Karst Conservancy and is not an ordinary tourist cave despite its size. Groups wanting to explore it have to apply to enter and are recommended to be expert or advanced cavers because of its difficulty. Because of its size as well, the tunnels are not well lit and you have to have all of the proper equipment like lights and padding to explore safely. Sullivan Cave has been known about since at least the 1800s because of markings that have been found in a room known as Backbreaker. This is a room that is essentially just a narrow tunnel, so low that you have to crawl through it. But, despite a few squeezes, this cave is actually massive. The largest room in the cave is known as the Colossus Room, and this massive chamber is 120 feet high and 200 feet long. In fact, in 1962, after a large area of the cave had already been mapped, another 2,000 feet of new passages were discovered in a single trip. Then, 4 months later, a further 8,000 more feet were discovered, along with 8 large chambers.
Wow, that's a long cave.
Over the years, vandalism became a problem, so in the 1990s, a large gate was put up at the cave entrance. From then on, any group wanted to enter the cave had to unlock a door on the way in, and then lock the door behind them to ensure no one else could enter.
Not like the,
In 2017, 19-year-old Lucas joined the caving club.
Different from that other one I watched yesterday.
It looked like a fun way to meet new people. Then in September, the club organized a visit to Sullivan Cave, which, despite its difficulty, was good for beginners, provided they had an experienced guide. On the 17th, Lucas and 11 other members of the club, including one staff member, drove to the parking lot of the cave. Before they got out, Lucas took off his jacket and left in the car. Then he picked up his bag with his water and some snacks, and then they all headed for the entrance. They reached the gate at about 10:30 a.m., and then the staff member unlocked the gate, and all 12 of them entered the cave. The first thing they did was divide into 2 groups, and then they set off exploring for almost 3 hours in the expansive tunnels and chambers. On the way back, as they got to the Backbreaker section, Lucas was not having a good time. So instead, he decided to just rush through it and catch up with the other group that was now in front of his
That's
group.
like a good idea.
As he quickly moved through the tunnels, he missed a narrow opening that led to the exit and accidentally headed into a different section. Upon realizing that he made a mistake, he decided to wait where he was so he wouldn't get lost further. Then, after waiting for about a half an hour, no one came to get him, and he couldn't hear anyone calling his name. So getting impatient, he searched around for a bit and found some arrow markings that seemed to point in the direction of the exit. He followed them and eventually saw a light off in the distance, which thankfully was the exit. But as he got closer, he didn't see anyone else. Then when he got right up to the gate, he realized the gate was locked. And not only was it locked, when he yelled out for the others, no one came to get him. What he didn't know is that they had already left, and they didn't even know he was missing. Now,
What?
at 3 p.m. or so, Lucas wasn't all that.
Okay, if I'm about to exit a cave like that and they're locked, I'd say, listen, we're gonna do roll call. We're not leaving until everybody is here. Unless, if they're stuck, then we're going to have one person leave for authorities. Because that's literally how you get people lost forever and ever and ever and ever. Nobody took a roll call for this guy. I'm beginning to question their,
Someone had to realize he was gone, and as soon as they did, they would come get him. He quickly took inventory of his stuff, which was just 2 Cliff Bars, 2 empty water bottles, and his phone. Next, he checked his phone and saw that he had no reception, but he could hear some cars from the road nearby. Without any other options, Lucas just started yelling for help, but he would go on to call for help for 6 to 8 hours, and as the day went on and it got darker and darker, it finally dawned on him that they must not have realized that he was missing. This sent a twinge of panic running down his body. If they didn't know he was missing, how long would it be until someone was at the cave next? As the night went on, bats started to come through the cave entrance, and knowing that they could possibly carry rabies, Lucas went deeper into the cave to find some place to sleep for the night. Eventually, he was able to fall asleep, where he would spend a long, cold night.
For the visionaries, for the trailblazers.
Dude, I couldn't imagine having to get stuck into a cave.
Supplies and solutions.
On the second day, Lucas went over to the entrance once again and waited desperately, hoping to see something. By this point, he was starting to get very thirsty and very hungry. He had eaten his 2 Cliff Bars, and he had already been out of water since the day prior. Tragically, to pass the time, he wrote goodbye letters to his family in case he wasn't found until it was too late. Then, in the evening of the second day, his phone battery died as well. In the damp, cold cave, he walked around to stay warm, and as his thirst got worse, he resorted to licking the cave walls for any moisture he could find. Then finally, he went to sleep again for another brutal night. When he woke up on the third day, now over 48 hours into his ordeal, he was desperately thirsty and could feel himself getting weaker by the second. Without having eaten in so long, it was also increasingly difficult to stay warm. He was getting so hungry that he even considered eating the crickets inside the cave. As the evening drew closer, Lucas curled up into the fetal position and waited silently. Then he thought he saw a light. Initially, not sure if he was dreaming, he took a closer look. When the light was still there, he ran up to the gate and watched as one of the caving club leaders walked quickly towards him with the key. This also happened to be the person who had locked him in there 3 days prior.
What an
After
idiot.
unlocking the gate, the leader, who was also an EMT, did a quick medical check on Lucas and found that he was in surprisingly good condition for having spent the last 60 hours in a cave. The rescuers then asked Lucas if he wanted to go to the hospital, but Lucas replied that he just wanted to go back to his room. In a classy move, Lucas collected all of his garbage that he had with him, which also inadvertently let rescuers know that his mental state was still intact. Otherwise, they might have insisted on bringing him to the hospital. An investigation into the events found that despite a pre-entry head count and a buddy-buddy system, Lucas was missed upon exiting the cave. Because the people in the club weren't all that familiar with one another, they also didn't realize he was missing. It wasn't until that third day that his clothing was found inside one of the vehicles that they realized that someone was missing. Lucas, again, a class act, later stated that he actually felt bad for the person who had accidentally locked him in there. Clearly, it had been an accident, even if it was one that could have gone much worse. First explored in 1941 by expert
Marathon, there's another cave.
Mosto Caverns are located in Yorkshire Dales National Park in England. This limestone cave system contains over 10 kilometers.
By the way, if you're gonna have a thing that's in there, you should actually have a lock on the inside of the cave. That way, if somebody is stuck inside, they can just push a button and they can get out. Bro, I wouldn't even care if they had the hatch open. Like, they should have a spring hatch, right? Where, like, if you have to hold on to it in order to, like, keep it open, but then after you let go, it just shuts automatically. That way, it can't. Like some way to avoid itself from being propped up. But there should be, like, a lock from the inside. That way, if you're stuck, you can easily get out.
Passages, and a round trip through the entire system can take between 8 and 10 hours.
For example, when I was climbing there's a thing called Go Ape National Park. When I was climbing this set of climb, right? Let's see. When I was climbing it, we had the entrances were locked, were behind these gates, and they had a code, and we had to unlock them. And if you got in, you got in. But if you didn't want to do anything, you could get out, and it was, like you could freely exit from the other side, but you had to have a code to enter in the other. You can.
In the caving community, because it has a ton of passageways that are only big enough to crawl through, and others where you're neck deep in water. Because of this, it has an official UK rating of 5 on the cave difficulty scale, which is the highest rating a cave can receive. It also has a river that runs through it called the Mossdale Bend that flows into the mouth of the cave and then just disappears. Using dye to color the 138 vertical feet lower, but the actual connecting route has never been discovered. That connection is considered one of the greatest mysteries in the caving community. On June 24th, 1967, a group of 10 entered the Mossdale Caverns with the hopes of completing excavations of the cave to try to find the legendary connection between the opening of the cave and where it emerged at the opening, known as Black Kells. And although the cave had been mapped extensively by that point, there were still several areas that seemed to be the most likely to hold the elusive extension that cavers had been seeking. In particular, their goal was to reach an area known as Stream End to blast some of the boulders that blocked potentially unexplored areas. At around 2 p.m., the group entered the cave and split into 2 groups. The first group comprised 6 very experienced cavers, who also brought equipment with them for their long journey to Stream End. And then group 2 was 4 less experienced cavers, who were just making a sightseeing trip as far as an area known as the Rough Chamber. There had been some rain in the area in the few days prior, but the quantity of water flowing into the caves was well below normal, which was perfect for their trip. The forecast for the day was mostly sunny with a chance of thundery showers in the evening, but nothing that would have been concerning for the group. At around 5 p.m., after exploring the rough chambers, the group of 4 returned back to the surface to an overcast sky and some light rain. They then left the cave and went back to the area they were staying to have some food and get changed. At around 7:30 p.m., one of those members returned to the entrance of the cave to find that despite the rain, the water levels were unchanged. With that reassurance, she once again returned back to the place they were staying for the night. Under the surface, the men passed through several easier sections before coming to their first real challenge, known as Farm Marathon. Now, based on all of the caving content I've covered, the Farm Marathon seems like one of the most challenging sections mentally of any cave, because it's a tunnel that is 900 feet long and just 10 inches high by 2 feet wide.
Oh my
On top of having
god.
to crawl through the passage
Hell no for that
in
one.
those claustrophobic conditions, the Mossdale Caverns have water flowing through them at various speeds in the various sections of the cave. This passageway has water flowing through the bottom of it, so in addition to crawling along their stomachs, they would literally be pulling themselves through water the entire time. But these men were cavers, this is what they lived for, and it would bring them to their destination, so they crawled onward. Then, about midway through Farm Marathon, the men would have heard a faint sound off in the distance. Probably not thinking much of it, the men would have crawled onward. The narrow passageway meant that they were forced in one direction, even if they wanted to turn around. Then they might have noticed that the water beneath their stomachs was moving faster, and that the light rumbling in the distance might have begun to sound more like a roar. Mossdale Caverns is also fearsome in the caving community because it has a tendency to flood. Back on the surface, the light rain had turned into a torrential downpour, and in the course of just a few hours, inches of rain had fallen. That same group member who had come to check out the cave earlier hurriedly returned to the cave entrance at 9 p.m. to find that where the entrance had been just a few hours earlier, there was now a swirling lake. The entire entrance was now submerged in water. She ran as fast as she could at 2 miles to a nearby farm and called the police. By 11 p.m., the cave rescue had begun. Because of the number of caves in the surrounding area, the rescuers were very used to cave rescues, but the Mossdale Caverns were different. The size and water flowing into them meant that the local rescuers couldn't do it alone. They had to call a larger cave rescue organization for help. Within hours, hundreds of rescuers and other volunteers were at the scene. To stop the flow of water, the rescuers had to dig a massive diversion ditch. Then after diverting the water, they had to build a dam to block the flow entirely. By the following morning, between the dam, diversion ditch, and 19 fire pumps, the water levels began to fall. And although the dam was shaky and needed constant repairs, a search team descended into the cave. They crawled with pits in their stomachs and found flood debris everywhere. Eventually, they reached the rough chamber and were able to peer over the ledge and see deeper into the cave. Hours earlier, the men crawled as fast as they could. The water flowed stronger and stronger beneath them until they eventually had a hard time keeping their heads out of the water. They frantically tried to reach the end of Farm Marathon in hopes of a passageway that would offer them refuge from the surging water. A man named John Ogden was in the front of the group and was the most experienced caver among them. Recognizing the gravity of the situation and seeing no end of the tunnel in sight, he found a crack in the ceiling they were in and climbed up into it. But the crack was tiny, there was no room for anyone else, and as John wedged himself further into the crack, he likely would have known that all 5 of the cavers, his friends, were drowning just a few feet below him. And eventually, the crack he was in also filled with water, and John succumbed to the same fate as the others. Hours later in the rough chamber, as the rescuers looked deeper into the cave, they saw that the passageways were still entirely submerged in water. This was already the afternoon of June 25th, 24 hours since the 6 had entered the cave, and 12 hours since the rescue had been launched. Unfortunately, we'll never know exactly when the 6 died, because no one is alive from the group to recount the events. However, it's likely that by the time the rescuers even entered the cave, the men had been dead for hours. Then at 5:40 p.m., the rescuers found 5 of the 6 men. All were deceased. That evening, exhausted rescuers decided it was unlikely the 6th man had survived either, and postponed the remaining search until the following day. Then, on Monday, June 26th, more rain delayed rescue efforts once again. Then, finally, on Tuesday, June 27th, John Ogden's body was discovered in a crack in Far Marathon.
Are you looking to register your business?
I don't have a business. I have no business. And your business is none of my business.
Officials deemed the rescue to be too dangerous to attempt, and so the cave was sealed with them inside. 3 years later, friends and family managed to move the bodies to a new area of the cave, safe from floods, now named the Sanctuary. Today, the Mossville Caverns disaster remains the worst in UK history. Gauteng is a province in South Africa that's known for its mineral-rich land and accounts for around a quarter of the total mineral production in the country. In the late 1890s, limestone miners in an area northwest of Johannesburg uncovered several fossils that looked to be human remains. Except, when the fossils were examined more closely, they seemed off. The miners then brought this to the attention of scientists, who started a formal exploration of the area for any more remains. Then in the 1930s, serious excavation of the area began as more and more resources were allocated to the discoveries. As more work was done, they realized these were not human remains. These were actually the remains of some of the earliest human ancestors, known as Australopithecus. These discoveries would later lead to an entire area being named the Cradle of Humankind because of the numerous prehistoric remains found in that small area. Some of these fossils have been dated to be over 2 million years old, which are some of the oldest to have ever been discovered. Part of the reason that so many fossils have been discovered in that area is because of the caves in that area that acted as a shelter. These offered a refuge that preserved the remains from animals and weather that might have otherwise degraded them more quickly. And since that initial discovery, significant paleontology work has been done in the area over the last century. In addition to the scientific work, the caves have become a massive tourist attraction. Because they're only 45 minutes from the largest city in South Africa, tours run every 30 minutes, 7 days a week. Each of these tours goes down to the cave known as the Sterkfontein Cave, giving tourists a close-up of the wildlife, the rock formations, and even an underground lake. As with many limestone caves, water runs through the rock and carves out deep, winding tunnels in random directions. The Sterkfontein Caves in particular look almost like a massive spiderweb because of how the tunnels branch out in all directions. Many of them are completely submerged in water and are in pitch black darkness because they're far from the entrance where any light could reach them. And woven into these tours is the harrowing tale of Peter Verhoeven. On September 29, 1984, Peter and 2 friends arrived at the cave to do some scuba diving in the underground lake. They each had a single aqualung, which is a type of scuba set, and a single light, and didn't require much else because of the depth of the water they would be going into. The 3 of them then entered the lake and began exploring the spiderweb of tunnels. Peter was the least experienced of the 3, and for some reason he kept letting go of the line and exploring side passages as they went. Now, in cave diving, the golden rule is to never enter a cave without a guideline. In addition to that, you're never supposed to let go of the guideline while you're in there, because generally, these limestone caves are impossible mazes. There's no rhyme or reason to the way the water carves out the tunnels. If you don't have a line to find your way out, the chance of getting lost is incredibly high. Each time Peter went off the line, his friends went to grab him, but on the 3rd time he let go of the line, his friends didn't see where he went. Then they went to search for him and found no trace of him. Soon, not wanting to go too far off the line themselves, they had to abandon their search for him and go get help. Meanwhile, after exploring briefly, Peter searched for the way back and realized that he was lost. He frantically searched for the tunnel back to the line, but very quickly realized he had made a huge mistake. If he didn't find a way out, he would eventually run out of gas and then drown. He continued to search around desperately, looking looking for the way back when miraculously he stumbled on an air pocket. And inside of this air pocket, there was actually even a small sandy island at the end of a tunnel. So Peter climbed up onto the island and figured out what to do next. At the very least, now he wouldn't run out of gas and drown. But because his air supply was limited, and because he had no idea where to go, he would have to wait until help came to get him. And thankfully, his friends had been on the line when he last saw them. They would definitely go get authorities, and then help would come. Peter just had to wait. And Peter did wait. He waited first until he got tired. When he was tired enough, he fell asleep for the night, but when he woke up, help still hadn't arrived. Then Peter waited the entire next day, and still no help came. Then the next day, and then an entire week had gone by as Peter sat in this pitch-black room, deep under the earth. Meanwhile, authorities scoured the tunnels, assuming that Peter had drowned, not knowing there was a pocket of air he could survive in. Days continued to go by like this, and although Peter had water to drink, he was getting desperately hungry alone in the dark. He also would have no way of knowing just how much time had passed, with there being no day and night cycle in the darkness. Finally, weeks later, a light filtered into the room where Peter was and started searching the darkness. Tragically, the light moved its way to the island, where they found Peter's body slumped over on some rocks. After weeks without food, Peter had died of starvation. Next to him was a message written in the sand that said, "I love you," to his wife and mother. From this message, it's clear that in his final days, Peter knew that the end was coming. An autopsy performed on his body found that he died approximately 3 weeks after he had gotten lost. In that time, rescuers searched 900 meters of undiscovered passages, mapping as they went to ensure they didn't backtrack. After finding nothing for weeks, the search was essentially called off when they discovered a small entrance close to the main section of the cave. In this new lead, there was another series of passages where they would eventually find a set of footprints. Then, 6 weeks to the day that Peter got lost, his body was found. Even more tragically, search and rescue teams had passed. Either neither party heard the other, or if Peter did hear them, there was simply no way for him to call out through the solid rock. So ultimately, he died alone in the dark. Hello everyone, my name is Sean, and welcome to Scary Interesting. If you're a long-time viewer of my channel, you may have recognized the middle story as one I've covered before.
They should have stayed out. Should have exploring gone
I
wrong.
don't have the right gear.
Save on all the best.
They should have stayed out.
In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories about cave exploring that went horrifyingly wrong. Today's final story is about a terrifying freak occurrence that has never happened before or since in the history of caving. I have to warn you, it is intense to say the least, so viewer discretion is advised.
Ooh.
In Alabama, 30 minutes east of Huntsville, there is a hiking trail that goes through the woods. This is a fairly ordinary looking trail. It's a little bit rocky and passes over several small creeks, but as you continue down this trail, hills start to rise up on either side. As you continue deeper into the forest, these keep growing until it's almost like you're walking into the mouth of a canyon. Near the end of this trail, a cliff rises up in the distance, and the trail seems to end at the foot of these cliffs. If you keep walking toward this, right before the cliffs, the ground slopes down very gently. Right at this spot, you have to be extremely careful because abruptly, the slope drops into a massive 143-foot pit straight into the ground.
Ooh.
This is the Stevens Gap Pit. It's one of 2 entrances to Stevens Gap Cave and by far the most dangerous way to enter. On one side of the pit, there's a flat edge that's decent to stand on, but the edge from the trail slopes down right into the massive opening. It's so easy to slip and fall right into it if you're not paying attention. And obviously, with the depth, it is certain death if you fall in. Thankfully, this isn't the only entrance to Stevens Gap. A few dozen feet over from the pit, there is a large opening with a much gentler slope that takes you almost to the bottom. But in order to reach the true bottom, which is the pit itself, you have to wind your way down a series of damp, rocky tunnels. As with most caves, this requires a helmet with a headlamp because of how dark it gets, even with these large openings. And thankfully as well, over the years, the cave was bought and requires a permit because it's now private property. This helps to conserve the cave and to prevent anyone from just wandering in and accidentally falling. This is also particularly dangerous at nighttime when the opening is not easily distinguishable from the pathway. In August of 1997, a woman named Karen was visiting Stevens Gap to do some exploring. And like many other more experienced cavers, she intended on rappelling into the pit all the way to the bottom instead of taking the easier entrance. So, she and the group she was with got to the entrance and then set up their rappel anchor near the edge. This is usually either by bolting into some rocks or by fixing a rope to some trees. Then she got on her harness and helmet, and at the front of her harness was her rappel device. This is a special device that allows you to feed rope through and control your descent speed. For her descent of 143 feet, the rope would need to be several dozen feet longer from the anchor point, plus some additional on the end of her slack. Once everything was ready and Karen was set to go, she grabbed a hold of the rope, got to the edge of the pit, and slowly backed over the edge as she let rope through the rappel device. She took a few steps down until eventually she was suspended over nothing but air. Then she was at 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, and right around 40 feet, the rope went right through the rappel device, and Karen plummeted 100 feet to the bottom of the pit and to her death.
Oh.
Karen had fed the wrong rope through the rappel device. The one she grabbed was the safety line that was only 40 feet long and had no knot at the end to prevent it from going right through the rappel device. Without realizing this, the rope slipped right through her fingers and sent her to the bottom of Stephen's Gap pit. Her body was later recovered from the bottom, and tragically, she is not the only person to have died at the bottom of this cave. In fact, several incidents almost exactly like this have occurred over the past few decades. There have been a few rope breaks, equipment failures, and accidental slips, and 4 people died here between 2015 and 2019 alone. All of this at the end of this seemingly ordinary trail through the woods. In May of 1990, 5 divers all gathered
Otter
at a campground
Springs.
near Gainesville, Florida to do some diving. That day, they were actually doing something known as potholing, which is where you go from spring to spring diving and checking out the underwater scenery. This area of Florida is perfect for that because of the sheer number of clear surface springs that are teeming with sea life. The spring they were going to explore in this campground is known as Otter Springs, which looks like any other ordinary pond. It's not very big, there are some trees going around the bank, and there's a grassy beach on the other side. What's cool about these springs, though, is that because the water is so clear and warm, there are often tons of fish and other sea life in them. And even though Otter Springs isn't a very large spring, it does go down to around 40 feet, and the water is very clear the whole depth. After the group had gotten suited up and started exploring the water, they all descended to the bottom of the spring to check out a large crack running along the floor. In this area as well, many of these springs are either fed by or open up into a large underwater cave system. Otter Springs is one of these, and at the bottom of the 40-foot depth, there's an entrance inside of a large horizontal crack that runs along the pond floor. All 5 of them got down into this crack and saw that it opened up even further into a rocky semicircle which tunneled off into the distance. Unfortunately, no one in this group was cave certified, so this was as far as they could safely go. In fact, this group was composed of a woman named Jackie, who was a former instructor of several of the others, brothers Ron and Alan, and then 2 friends, Chris and Ken. And other than Jackie, who had over 100 dives, and Ron, who had done 52 dives, the others had done less than 7 dives each, so definitely not enough experience to even think about going inside. But as they sat at the entrance, Jackie could see that Ken wanted to go inside. She got his attention and shook her head not to, and knowing that she was the most experienced, he gave her an okay back. Then she pointed to a gauge because they were far enough into their dive that it was time to head back up, and then she started swimming up to the surface. But not fully appreciating the danger, Ken still really wanted to go in the cave, which the others could tell as well and tried talking him out of it. But before long, Ken was making his way into the tunnel. They quickly went in after him to make sure he didn't get lost, but soon enough, they were all kind of enjoying it. As they swam around checking out the different passages and showing each other the cool stuff they were seeing, they figured that when they were done, they'd simply retrace their steps and head back out, and it would be no big deal. When Jackie got to the surface and looked back down, she saw that no one had followed her, and her heart sank. Right away, she was pretty upset that they'd gone in, especially because it wasn't as simple as just going in after them. She sort of had to wait helplessly until they came back up on their own. At this point, there were still lots of bubbles coming up from the entrance, though, so she hoped they would just be in and out quickly and then come back up. Then she got out of the water to the bank of the spring and watched the water anxiously. Inside the cave, the 4 others made their way deeper and deeper, having a blast checking out the tunnels. Then Ron stopped for a second to look at his gauge, and as soon as he lifted his head again, all of the silt they had been kicking up everywhere caught up to him and completely blinded him. He couldn't see the walls, the ceiling, up, down, and then without realizing it, he was hyperventilating, swimming around in a panic.
Uh-oh.
He swam around frantically, bumping into the walls and the ceiling, and then more walls, all while breathing way more air than he should have been. And then, miraculously, there was light. Somehow, in his panic, he had just happened to stumble back on the exit and immediately swam back up to the surface. As soon as he surfaced, he looked around and saw Jackie standing on the bank and asked where the others were. In his mind, he'd been searching desperately for a long time and thought he was the last person to surface. In reality, he was the first person to surface. Everyone else was still somewhere inside. Jackie contemplated going back in, but with only a little bit of air left, she realized it would be a mistake. And while they were having this conversation, it clearly sounded panicked, and a man nearby walked over and asked them if everything was okay. He'd seen everyone go down, and then asked them if they were cave certified. Then he asked if they'd gone to the cave, and as soon as they said yes, he took off running. But
Said race fast heartburn relief with gums.
There shouldn't be. There it is.
by chance, there was a barbecue going on that day attended by diving legend Woody Jasper.
Hmm?
Not only did he have over 500 dives, but he had all of his equipment with him in the back of his truck. Before long, he was running over and suiting up to get in the water, and not only was he angry that they'd been so irresponsible, he knew that the chances of getting them out alive were very slim. They'd been in for almost an hour at that point, which was a long time for the type of equipment they had on, especially if they were panicked. Finally, Woody dropped into the water, made his way to the cave entrance, and saw that it was clear of any silt. This meant that no one had been in this area for a while, and the three left inside were not close to the entrance. As he got into the tunnels, he was almost certain that this would be a body recovery. Then he made his way deeper in and came up to an obvious fork, with one tunnel leading left and the other tunnel leading right. One of these was still cloudy, so he went into that tunnel, and almost immediately this proved to be right. When not far into the tunnel, he found a mask on the floor. In a panicked state, divers will often lose their masks or take them off shortly before drowning. The mask then sinks to the bottom, while their body stays in place. Then Woody looked directly up from the mask and saw 4 legs huddled together in a crevice, but he couldn't see their heads because they were in a small air pocket that had been created by their own expelled gas. He released some of his own gas to bubble up and signal them, but they didn't respond. Then he tried pulling on their legs and realized they were unconscious in the gas pocket. This gas pocket was created by their expelled air and didn't have enough oxygen to keep them alive. At some point, they had passed out and were now slowly suffocating. Upon realizing this, he grabbed one of them and immediately headed for the surface. As soon as he was out of the water, Jackie saw that it was Alan. He was blue and he wasn't breathing or responding. They got him back to the bank and started CPR right away, while Woody went right back down into the cave. He quickly got to the fork and went back to the crevice, but this time, incredibly, the other diver was moving. The gas Woody used to try to signal them was just enough for him to regain consciousness. Woody then swam up to him and grabbed his hand to reassure that help was there. On the surface, CPR continued, and soon enough they noticed that Alan's eye started to move around. It seemed as though Alan might pull through. Then all of a sudden, the person performing compressions actually felt a heartbeat under his hand as Alan started to regain consciousness. He still had tons of water in his lungs, and there was no telling how much brain damage he might have due to lack of oxygen, but at least for now, he was alive. Back in the tunnels, Woody buddy moved with the other diver all the way to the surface, where Jackie thought it was correct, and by the time they got there, he was able to get out of the water on his own. Woody immediately went right back down.
I hate how they
who had been in the water the longest.
I hate how they made this.
Then past the air pocket, and eventually to Ken's body. Unlike the other two, he had drowned. He was brought back up to the surface, and CPR was performed, but he would never regain consciousness. He was simply without oxygen for too long, and Jackie would even say he looked different when he was brought up. She knew right away there was no saving him. If you've seen my video covering the Moss Hill Caverns disaster, you might remember that it took place in Yorkshire Dales National Park in England.
We heard about that.
This area is unique in that it possesses the perfect combination of conditions for the landscape to be riddled with caves. The surface here is covered in limestone, and it rains in England as much as it's stereotyped to do, making this area a caver's dream. In this one national park, there are over 2,500 known caves, and probably many more that have yet to be discovered. Many of these connect together through impossibly tight passages, and others are their own distinct, expansive systems. Many of these are just small potholes, and many of these are massive underground labyrinths that possess chambers large enough to fit entire buildings into. About an hour from the edge of this national park is Tadcaster Grammar School, which is a high school that takes students on all sorts of exciting field trips. This might be out to the coast to see the ocean, or to the countryside, and yearly to the caves of Yorkshire Dales. And the students love caving. Contrary to what many people imagine caving as, it's not all tight squeezes and claustrophobia-inducing crawling. Caves come in different shapes and difficulties, with beginner and intermediate caves allowing newer cavers to explore the alien underground world without much of the associated danger. These are exactly the types of conditions that the students set out to experience in November of 2005. From the school in Tadcaster, they traveled an hour northwest toward the Park Welcome Center. There, they traveled another 45 minutes or so through the rolling green hills of the English countryside. Along these 2-lane roads marked with little stone walls on either side, the students made their way deeper into Yorkshire Dales National Park before coming on a depression in one of the hills. From a distance, this looks like nothing more than a small divot in the green hillside, completely unremarkable. It's covered in some bushes, and there's you can see that this depression keeps going into the hillside and eventually turns into a small opening. This opening is actually the entrance to a cave known as Manchester Hole. This entrance, as with many in the area, gives no indication of the huge expanse of tunnels under the Earth's surface. In fact, Manchester Hole alone descends for over 1,000 feet underground, and it's even part of a larger system known as Goyden Pond. This larger system is miles and miles of tunnels that you'd never expect to be underneath the grassy hills above. But despite its size, Manchester Hole is not a very technically challenging cave. There aren't any super tight squeezes or large vertical shafts, and there isn't much special equipment required other than some waterproof clothing. This makes it a popular destination for amateur cavers and novices because you can still get all of the cave experience without any of the additional danger. And so it was perfect for this class of 14-year-olds on their first caving adventure. From a rocky creek bed, the group of 10 students and 3 teachers pulled on their yellow rubber suits and helmets fixed with headlamps and then made their way into the depression in the hillside. From the entrance, the bushes and other vegetation quickly disappears down a series of descending boulders as the light no longer filters in. The group then made their way into a horizontal corridor filled with large, jagged boulders and about an 8-foot-high ceiling. And already it was very dark. Just the smallest amount of light from their headlamps lit up the hallway. Then they made their way into the first large chamber, which is almost like a theater because of how big it is. This room has some small puddles and a stream running its length, but interestingly, it didn't have many stalactites on the ceiling. Instead, it looked as though there was mud caked on the ceiling, giving the rocks a dirty brown finish instead of the usual gray. The students took a look around the chamber and then moved into the next series of passages, which is more or less a scramble over a bunch of boulders. And just like the students the year before, they were having a blast exploring the underground world. Then they went through one more large room before coming up with the only real challenge in Manchester Hole. This challenging section is known as the Crawl. It's about 40 feet long, and the ceiling here is much lower than the rest of the cave at around 3 feet high. Then right in the middle of this length, there is a U-shaped depression in both the floor and the ceiling. So as you're crawling along, you have to go down into this depression and then back up on the other side. But in comparison to the tight squeezes of some other caves, this crawl isn't much of a challenge. 3 feet is...
I hate the new way they made this freaking... Oh my god.
Across the 40-foot crawl that had about 6 inches of water running along the bottom. Now over 1,000 feet into the cave and a couple of hours into the trip, the students split into smaller groups and started checking out some of the fossil formations that cover the walls at this depth. It was around this point in their trip that they might have noticed something terrifying happening inside the cave. Upriver of the Manchester Hole is a water reservoir that supplies water to the nearby area. On one side of this reservoir is a dam to keep all of the water in, and this stone dam has a walkway that runs across the top. Supporting this walkway are these big stone arches that look similar to the arches of an aqueduct. The water level in this reservoir fluctuates based on the demand nearby and how much it rains, and so inside the reservoir, this means that the water level will either be far from the arches or right up to the arches. Traditionally, the water level inside Manchester Hole can be reliably predicted by how close the water is to the arches. When the water is close to the arches, this means that it's been raining a lot, and so naturally, there will be a lot of water inside the cave. When the water is far from the arches, the cave is much drier. That day, the water was high, but there wasn't any rain in the forecast, so this shouldn't have been an issue. Except, that day, while they were exploring, the winds on the surface became violently strong and caused massive waves to form in the reservoir. These then crashed through the arches and caused the river to rise several feet in under an hour. And because these caves often have multiple entrances and drainage systems, this then poured directly into Manchester Hole. And the reason that the Manchester Hole has mud along the ceiling is that, as with the Moss Toe Caverns, it tends to flood completely. As the students went around exploring, all of a sudden, within just a few minutes, the water went from ankle deep to chest deep. And with how quickly this happened, everyone went into a complete panic and started sprinting toward the exit. Each of the smaller groups made their way through the corridors, fighting the freezing cold water rushing in and the currents that it created, and eventually they all got to the crawl, which created a bottleneck and slowed down their progress. With how high the water had gotten, it completely submerged the U-shaped depression midway through. This meant that the students had to literally swim through the freezing rushing water to get through to the other side, and to find their way through the water, all they had were their now dimming headlamps. As they lined up to go through one by one, in last was one of the instructors and one of the students named Joseph. Joseph was a really strong swimmer, and knowing this, he let a bunch of students go through before him to make sure they could get through the strong currents. Finally, once all the other students had gone through, the two of them went in together and started swimming. Before they could get to the other side, they bumped into some of the other students who hadn't cleared the way yet and forced them to turn back around. So they came back out on the other side, waited for a few moments, and then went right back in. This time, Jo went ahead of the instructor, and the last time she saw him, he was heading through the tunnel ahead of her. This time, she came up out of the water, and the way was clear, so they all kept running toward the exit. Thankfully, they made it safely to the surface, where they were surprised to see that no rain had fallen, but the creek that was there when they first entered was now a rushing river. Then they did a head count and got 12. Then they counted again, and it was 12 again. And then they realized that Joe wasn't with them. Joe hadn't made it to the other side of the crawl, but in the chaos, no one had realized until they made it out of the cave. And in the area they were in, there wasn't even any cell reception to contact emergency services. As soon as they were in range, they made the call, and by late afternoon, 40 rescuers descended on the cave. With the water already much lower, it took them less than an hour to make their way to the crawl, and tragically, Joe was found lying lifelessly on the other side. He was in a state of severe hypothermia and was removed from the cave and taken to the hospital as fast as possible, but unfortunately, he never regained consciousness. This was just devastating for his friends and family because not only had he died a hero trying to help other students, he was just beloved by everyone. At Tadcaster, he was a star student and athlete and was considered by everyone to have an incredibly bright future ahead of him. To make matters worse, it's not entirely clear what happened that caused his death. The leading theory is that the combination of the dimming headlamps, the freezing water, and a possible surge of water resulted in him going down the wrong passage. Then, he wasn't able to make it back before running out of air and passing out. Then, sometime later, the water flushed his body back to the other side of the crawl. With this tragic loss, obviously, many people were angry and felt that there was some negligence on the part of the instructors. With